Some sounds don't come from the world outside. They come from somewhere that refuses to be forgotten. The clock on Ethan Cole's nightstand read 2:59 a.m. when the first sound came. Not loud, not sharp, but just enough to pull him from the shallow edge of sleep. The kind of sleep that never quite reached rest. The kind he had carried home from places he no longer spoke about. Beside the bed, Rex was already awake, sitting upright, his broad chest rising slowly, ears forward, eyes fixed not on the door, not on the window, but somewhere lower, somewhere closer, as if he were listening to something. Ethan could not hear. The second the digital clock flicked to 3 o'clock, Rex moved, not in panic, not in fear, but with a quiet urgency, stepping off the worn wooden floor with careful weight and padding toward the far corner of the room, where the boards darkened slightly with age, where the grain of the wood seemed tighter, older, almost as if it had been replaced long ago and never spoken of again. Ethan exhaled slowly, dragging a hand across his face, the stubble rough against his palm, his body heavy, reluctant, every muscle carrying the dull echo of years spent bracing for impact, for noise, for something breaking the silence too suddenly. "Not tonight, boy," he muttered under his breath, his voice low, steady, the way it had been trained to stay even no matter what moved in the dark. But Rex didn't turn, didn't retreat, didn't obey. Instead, he stood there, still as stone, staring at the floor as though waiting for it to answer him. The cabin around them held its breath, the walls creaking softly as the night air pressed against the timber, a faint wind slipping through the cracks like a whisper that had lost its way. And for a moment, Ethan almost convinced himself it was nothing, just another restless night, just another trick of a mind that hadn't learned how to stop listening. But then Rex made a sound, not a bark, not a growl, but something softer, deeper, a low, uncertain whine that rose from his chest and faded just as quickly. The kind of sound he had only ever made when something didn't belong. Ethan pushed himself upright, the mattress springs giving a tired groan beneath his weight as his boots found the floor, the cold seeping instantly through the worn soles, sharper than it should have been, colder than the rest of the room. And that was the first thing that didn't sit right. He stood there for a second, just feeling it, the chill spreading slowly upward, as if the ground itself held a memory it hadn't let go of. Rex shifted his weight, placing one paw gently against the boards, then pulling it back, repeating the motion once more, measured, deliberate, like a signal he expected Ethan to understand. "What is it?" Ethan asked quietly, though he already knew the dog wouldn't answer in any way he could explain. And yet, somehow, he always did. The clock behind him blinked steadily. 3:01 now, the red numbers casting a faint glow across the room. But the silence had changed, not louder, not clearer, just heavier, as though something beneath the surface had begun to stir. Ethan took a step closer, the wood beneath his boots giving a soft creak, his breath slowing without him realizing it, his body falling into an old rhythm, the kind that came before decisions you couldn't take back. Rex didn't move, didn't look away, his amber eyes locked on that same spot, waiting, listening, as if whatever was down there had already called once and was about to call again. The air did not move, yet something in the room felt unsettled, as if the silence itself had shifted its weight and was waiting to see what Ethan would do next. He crouched slowly, the joints in his knees stiff from years that had taken more than they had given back, and placed his palm flat against the wooden floor where Rex kept pointing. And there it was again, that cold, deeper than the night air, deeper than the winter pressing against the cabin walls, a kind of cold that did not belong to weather but to something sealed away, something untouched by time. He kept his hand there longer than he meant to, his breath steady, his eyes narrowing slightly as he focused not on what he could see, but on what he might feel, because that was how he had learned to survive once, by listening to what could not be heard, by trusting the smallest shift beneath the surface. Rex lowered himself beside him, pressing his ear gently against the boards, his body completely still now, every muscle tuned to a signal only he could follow. And then, after a few seconds, the dog tapped once with his paw, paused, and tapped again, a slow, deliberate rhythm that made something tighten in Ethan's chest. He had seen that pattern before, not in this cabin, not in any place that should have felt like home, but in another life where the ground had never been just ground and where Silence had always meant something was hidden beneath it. Ethan pulled his hand back slightly, then pressed it down again, firmer this time, his fingers spreading across the grain of the wood, and for a moment he thought he imagined it, just a faint suggestion, a whisper of movement. But then it came again, so subtle it could have been nothing more than a shift in pressure, except it was not random, it carried a pattern, a spacing that his mind began to count without asking permission. He closed his eyes, just for a second, letting the rhythm settle in, and there it was, steady, distant, but real, like something reaching upward through layers that were never meant to be crossed. No, he murmured under his breath, not in denial, but in disbelief, because part of him already understood what this meant, and part of him did not want to. The clock behind him ticked forward to 3:03, the faint hum of its circuitry the only sound that belonged to the surface world, but down here, under his hand, something else was answering back. Rex let out another low sound, softer this time, almost pleading, his eyes lifting to meet Ethan's, and in them was something that went beyond instinct, beyond training, something that felt like trust, like certainty, as if the dog already knew that whatever waited below had been waiting long enough. Ethan shifted his weight, rising just enough to look around the room, his gaze moving across the worn walls, the old beams, the corners where dust had gathered over years of quiet. And for the first time since he had arrived, the cabin did not feel empty. It felt layered, as if it had been holding something beneath its surface all along, something that had chosen this moment to be heard. He reached for the edge of the nearby rug and pulled it back slowly, revealing more of the floorboards beneath, darker here, slightly uneven, the nails older, set deeper than the rest, and that was when he saw it. Not clearly at first, just a faint outline where the wood did not quite align with itself, a shape too deliberate to be natural. Rex stood immediately, his posture alert, his tail still, watching every movement Ethan made as if each second mattered. Ethan ran his fingers along the edge of that outline, feeling the difference in texture, the subtle gap where two worlds met but never acknowledged each other, and the realization settled into him quietly, without drama, without fear, just a simple, undeniable truth that rose from somewhere deeper than thought. Whatever was beneath this floor was not new. It had been here long before him, long before the silence, waiting for something, or someone, willing to listen, and tonight, for reasons he could not yet explain, it had chosen him. The outline in the wood became clearer the longer Ethan traced it, not because the light had changed, but because his mind had begun to accept what his eyes were seeing. A shape too precise to be coincidence, a rectangle set into the floor as if someone had once needed to hide something and had done it carefully, quietly, without leaving a story behind. He pressed his fingers along the edge again, slower this time, until he felt it, a slight give, almost invisible, the kind of detail most people would have missed, but not him, not after years of learning how small differences could mean everything. Rex shifted closer, his breath steady but heavier now, his focus unbroken, and when Ethan glanced at him, the dog held his gaze for just a second, as if asking a question without words, as if making sure he was ready. Ethan exhaled and leaned back on his heels, his eyes moving across the room once more, taking in the quiet, the stillness, the way the cabin seemed to hold itself, tighter around this one spot. And then he reached for the edge of the old tool crate near the wall, dragging it across the floor with a low scrape that sounded louder than it should have in the silence. Inside were the few things he had kept close since leaving everything else behind: a worn flashlight, a flathead screwdriver, a small pry bar that had seen more use than it was meant for, tools that were simple, reliable, and honest in a way the world often was not. He picked up the pry bar and turned it once in his hand, feeling the familiar weight settle into his grip, grounding him, reminding him that some actions were straightforward even when their reasons were not. Rex stepped back just enough to give him space, but his eyes never left the floor, his ears still forward, listening to something that had not stopped, something that continued its quiet rhythm beneath the surface. Ethan placed the tip of the pry bar into the thin gap he had found and applied pressure, slow at first, testing, the wood resisting just enough to confirm it had not been meant to open easily, but not enough to deny him entirely. The board creaked softly, a long, tired sound, as if it had been holding that position for years and was not sure it wanted to change. And for a moment Ethan paused, his hands still, his breath measured, because something about that sound felt like a line being crossed. He had lived long enough to know that once you opened something buried, you did not get to choose what came with it. Rex let out a quiet whine, softer than before but more insistent, and Ethan nodded slightly, not to the dog, but to the decision forming inside him, the one that had already been made the moment he chose to listen. He pressed down again, firmer this time, and the edge of the board lifted just enough to break the seal that had held it in place, releasing a faint rush of air that carried a different kind of cold, deeper, older, like something that had not seen the surface in a very long time. Ethan set the pry bar aside and used both hands to pull the board upward, revealing a narrow opening beneath, darkness filling the space below like water in a well. Thick and unreadable. He reached for the flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting clean through the dim cabin light as he angled it downward, illuminating the edges first, then the shape beneath. Not earth, not stone, but something constructed, something deliberate, metal set into place with intention. Rex moved closer again, peering into the opening, his body tense but not afraid. And as the light settled, Ethan saw it clearly, a metal surface just below the boards, worn but intact, with a small recessed handle built into its center, the kind of handle meant to be pulled from above or below. Ethan stared at it for a long second, the weight of what he was seeing settling into him. Quietly, because this was no accident, no natural hollow or forgotten crawl space. This was something made to be hidden, something meant to wait, and beneath his feet, just beyond the reach of the light, that faint, steady rhythm continued, patient, measured, as if whatever lay below had known all along that eventually someone would open the door. The metal surface did not reflect much light, only a dull, muted sheen that suggested age rather than neglect, as if it had been built to last longer than the memory of the hands that placed it there. Ethan leaned closer, the beam of the flashlight steady in his grip, tracing the edges of the hatch, noting the way it fit seamlessly into the frame beneath the floorboards. No rust breaking through, no obvious damage, just quiet endurance. The recessed handle sat flush against the surface, its outline worn smooth by time or perhaps by use, though there was no way to tell which, and that uncertainty lingered longer than he expected. Rex let out a soft breath beside him, the sound almost human in its restraint, and lowered his head again, listening, always listening, as though whatever lay beneath was speaking in a language only he understood. Ethan adjusted his stance, one knee pressing into the wood, the other foot planted firmly, grounding himself in the moment, because something about this felt familiar in a way that was difficult to name. Not the place, not the object, but the feeling of standing above something hidden, something waiting to be uncovered, something that could change the shape of a quiet night without warning. He reached down slowly and brushed his fingers against the handle, the metal colder than the air around it. Colder than it should have been, and for a brief second he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because he knew that whatever came next would not be undone. Rex shifted again, this time placing both front paws near the opening, his posture alert, his tail low but steady, and when Ethan glanced at him, the dog gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of movement, a signal as clear as any command they had ever shared. Ethan wrapped his fingers around the handle and pulled gently at first, testing the resistance, the metal holding firm as though it had not been touched in years. Then he applied more pressure, slow and controlled, feeling the weight of it respond, the seal breaking with a quiet release that echoed faintly into the darkness below. The hatch lifted only an inch before stopping, something beneath it shifting as if reluctant to give way, and Ethan paused again, his breath slowing, his ears tuning instinctively to the space below, searching for anything that might confirm what his mind was beginning to piece together. The faint rhythm was still there, steady, deliberate, but now it felt closer, clearer, no longer just a suggestion beneath the floor, but something contained within the space he was about to open. He lifted the hatch further, inch by inch, until it tilted enough for the beam of the flashlight to slip past its edge and spill into the chamber below, revealing the top of a narrow metal ladder descending into darkness, each rung spaced evenly, leading downward in a straight line that disappeared beyond the reach of the light. The air that rose from the opening carried a different weight, cooler, denser, tinged with the faint scent of metal and something older, something that had not moved freely in a long time. Rex leaned forward but did not step in, his instincts holding him at the edge, his ears flicking once as if catching something new. Something shifting now that the barrier had been lifted. Ethan held the hatch steady. With one hand, and angled the flashlight deeper, the beam revealing more of the ladder, then a small landing below, just barely visible, where the light caught the outline of another surface, another door. Perhaps, or a wall. It was difficult to tell. He swallowed slowly, the dryness in his throat unexpected but not unfamiliar. And for a moment he simply stood there, suspended between the quiet life above and whatever waited below. The distance between the two measured not in feet, but in the decision to take the first step. Behind him, the clock continued its steady count, marking time in a world that still believed nothing had changed. But here, in the narrow space between wood and metal, between silence and sound, something had already begun to move, something that had been waiting not just to be found, but to be heard. And now that it had been given a voice, however faint, it was no longer willing to remain hidden. The ladder did not creak when Ethan placed his weight on the first rung, which unsettled him more than if it had, because it meant the structure below had been built with care, with intention, designed to endure quietly without drawing attention. And as he lowered himself down, one hand gripping the cold metal, the other holding the flashlight steady, the light above him began to shrink, the open hatch becoming a dim square of pale gray that felt farther away with each step. Rex remained at the edge for a moment, watching, listening, as if making a decision of his own, and then with a controlled movement, he followed, placing his paws carefully on each rung, his body moving with the same disciplined precision he had learned long before this cabin had ever entered their lives. The air grew cooler the deeper they went, not sharp, not biting, but heavy, carrying a stillness that pressed gently against the skin, and Ethan could feel it settling into his lungs with each breath, a reminder that this space had been sealed from the world above for far too long. The beam of the flashlight stretched downward, revealing the small landing he had seen from above, a narrow platform no more than 4 feet wide, bordered by smooth concrete walls that rose up around it, clean lines, no cracks, no signs of decay, only the quiet strength of something built to last. When his boots finally touched the floor, the sound was soft, absorbed almost instantly, as if the room itself did not wish to echo, and that absence of sound made everything else feel sharper, more present, more aware. Rex stepped off the ladder behind him, his nails clicking faintly against the concrete before he stilled again, his head turning slowly from side to side, his senses reaching into corners the light had not yet touched. Ethan lifted the flashlight and swept it across the space, revealing a second door set into the far wall, metal like the hatch above, but thicker, reinforced with a handle shaped differently, built to be opened from this side. Above it, mounted slightly off-center, was a small panel, its surface dulled by time, with a single round indicator that pulsed faintly, not bright enough to illuminate the room, but steady enough to confirm what Ethan had begun to suspect. Whatever was down here had not been abandoned completely. The rhythm he had felt above was clearer now, no longer filtered through layers of wood and space, but present, contained within these walls, a soft, measured pulse that seemed to come from beyond the door, not mechanical exactly, not entirely natural either, something in between, something that did not fit easily into the categories he had learned to trust. Rex moved closer to the door, lowering his head again, his ear pressing gently against the surface, and after a second, he gave a quiet, urgent whine, then tapped once with his paw, the same pattern as before, but faster now, more insistent, as if time itself had begun to matter. Ethan stepped forward slowly, his boots deliberate against the concrete, every instinct telling him to stay aware, to stay grounded, because this was no longer just curiosity, no longer just a question of what lay beneath his home. This was something active, something reaching back. He raised his hand and hovered it near the door, not touching it yet, feeling the faint vibration that traveled through the metal, subtle but undeniable, like a heartbeat heard through a wall, steady, Patient, waiting. Behind him, the ladder stood silent. The opening above now just a distant frame of dim light. And for a brief moment, Ethan understood the distance he had crossed, not in feet, but in trust in. The choice to follow something he could not explain. Rex looked back at him once, his eyes bright, focused, certain, and in that look was the same message he had given from the beginning, simple and unwavering. This is where the truth is. Ethan let out a slow breath, placed his hand firmly on the handle, and felt the faint tremor answer him from the other side, as if whatever lay beyond had known he was coming, and had been waiting for the moment he would finally arrive. The handle resisted for a fraction of a second before yielding under Ethan's grip, not with force, but with a quiet acceptance, as if the mechanism had been waiting for the right moment rather than the right amount of pressure, and when the door finally opened, it did so without a sound, swinging inward just enough to let the beam of the flashlight slip through and reveal what lay beyond. The space inside was larger than he expected, not expansive, but purposeful, a compact chamber with smooth walls and a ceiling low enough to make the air feel closer, more contained, and at its center, mounted against the far side, was a narrow table lined with equipment that should not have been active, yet clearly was. A small radio unit sat there, its surface worn but intact, a thin antenna extending upward, and beside it, a panel of dials and switches, some dark, some faintly illuminated, each one steady, each one holding its place as if time had moved around them rather than through them. The pulse Ethan had felt was stronger here, no longer subtle, but still restrained, emanating from the radio itself, a rhythmic signal that clicked softly in intervals too precise to be random, too deliberate to be ignored. Rex stepped into the room slowly, his body low, cautious but not afraid, his ears forward, his eyes fixed on the source of the sound, and as he approached the table, he let out a quiet breath, the tension in his frame shifting into something closer to recognition. Ethan followed, his boots measured against the floor, his gaze moving across the chamber, taking in the details that spoke of intention, of preparation, of a place built not for comfort, but for waiting. The walls held no decoration, no signs of life beyond function. Only a few mounted shelves with neatly arranged tools and a sealed container in the corner, untouched, its surface free of dust in a way that suggested it had been opened not long ago, or perhaps never truly closed. He stepped closer to the radio, the sound clearer now, a steady sequence of soft clicks followed by a pause, then repeated again, and something in the pattern stirred a memory he had not expected to return, a training exercise, long ago, where signals were reduced to their simplest form, stripped of noise, leaving only intent behind. He tilted his head slightly, listening, not with his ears alone, but with the part of him that had once been responsible for understanding what others could not hear, and slowly, the pattern began to separate itself, not just a pulse, but a message, structured, repeated, consistent. Rex sat down beside the table, his posture calm now, his work done, his role fulfilled, as if the moment of discovery had already passed. For him, and what remained belonged to Ethan alone. Ethan reached out and adjusted the dial slightly, the signal sharpening just enough to clarify the intervals. And there it was, unmistakable now, not a sound of distress, not a call of panic, but something far more deliberate, a signal that had been sent with patience, with discipline, with the belief that someone, someday, would understand. His breath slowed as the realization settled into him, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a memory returning through layers of silence. This was not random. This was not recent. This had been here, repeating, waiting, holding its place through days, through nights, through every moment he had slept above it without knowing. And now, standing in the quiet center of that hidden room, with Rex watching silently at his side, Ethan understood that the signal had never been meant for just anyone. It had been meant for someone who knew how to listen, someone who had learned long ago that even the smallest sound could carry the weight of something unfinished, something that had not yet found its way back to the surface. The pattern did not fade once Ethan recognized it. It grew clearer, sharper, as if understanding had unlocked something within the signal itself, and he leaned slightly closer to the radio, his eyes narrowing, his mind shifting into a place he had not visited in years, a place where meaning lived inside rhythm and silence spoke between intervals. The clicks were not random, not mechanical noise, but structured, deliberate, repeating in a sequence that carried intent. And as he counted the spacing in his head, something old stirred to life, a memory of nights spent listening through static, waiting for fragments of information to align into something human. Rex remained still beside him, his presence steady, grounding, as if he already knew that whatever came next belonged to Ethan alone. The room seemed to quiet even further, the faint hum of the equipment fading into the background as the signal took center stage, guiding his focus, drawing him deeper into its rhythm. One click, pause. 2 clicks, longer pause. 3, then a break, repeating again with exact precision, and Ethan felt the pattern settle into him, not just as sound, but as language, stripped down to its simplest form. He reached out slowly and adjusted the volume just enough to hear the edges of each pulse more clearly, his breathing syncing unconsciously with the intervals, his thoughts aligning with the sequence until the meaning began to surface. It was not immediate, not a sudden realization, but a gradual unfolding, like a word remembered after years of silence. Coordinates, he thought at first, but no, the spacing was too personal, too intentional, less about location, more about identity. Rex shifted slightly, his head tilting as if sensing the change in Ethan, the shift from uncertainty to recognition, and for a moment their eyes met again, the same quiet understanding passing between them, the same trust that had carried them through places neither of them ever needed to name. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry, as the final pieces fell into place. The pattern no longer just a signal, but a message, repeated over and over, waiting for someone who could hear it not just with their ears, but with memory. It was a name, not spoken, but encoded, spelled out through the rhythm itself, a call that had refused to fade, that had continued long after it should have ended. His hand hovered near the radio, not touching it now, just existing in the space where past and present seemed to overlap, and for a moment he closed his eyes, letting the sound move through him without resistance, letting it settle where it needed to. The air in the chamber felt different now, not heavier, but fuller, as if something long suspended had finally found its way back into motion. Rex lowered himself to the ground, resting quietly, his job complete, his instincts having led them exactly where they needed to be. And in that stillness, Ethan understood something that did not require explanation. This was not just a signal left behind, not just a machine doing what it had been built to do. This was something held in place by intention, by memory, by a promise that had not yet been fulfilled. The clicks continued, steady and patient, as they always had, but now they carried weight, they carried meaning. And as Ethan opened his eyes again and looked at the radio, he knew with a quiet certainty that whatever this message was, whoever had sent it, it had not been waiting for just anyone, it had been waiting for him. The name did not echo in the room, yet it filled the space in a way sound alone could not, settling into Ethan's chest with a weight that was neither sudden nor overwhelming, but steady, undeniable, like something that had always been there waiting to be remembered. He did not say it out loud, did not need to, because the pattern continued to speak it for him, each interval precise, each pause intentional. As if the signal itself refused to let the memory fade again, his gaze drifted from the radio to the surrounding walls, to the shelves, to the sealed container in the corner that now felt less like an object and more like a part of the same story, a piece of something that had been carefully arranged long before he ever stepped into this place. Rex remained still, his breathing slow, his eyes half-lidded but aware, as though the urgency that had driven him here had softened now that the purpose had been fulfilled. Ethan stepped away from the radio, the sound continuing behind him, constant, patient, and moved toward the container, his boots making only the faintest sound against the floor, absorbed quickly by the quiet that seemed to live within these walls. The container was metal, reinforced, its surface marked by subtle scratches that spoke of handling, not neglect, and when he placed his hand on it, he felt no resistance, no lock, only a simple latch waiting to be opened. He hesitated for a brief moment, not out of fear, but out of respect for the sequence unfolding around him. because everything down here had revealed itself in its own time, and he had learned not to rush what had chosen to wait this long. Rex lifted his head slightly, watching, but did not move, offering no signal now, no guidance, only presence. Ethan unlatched the container and lifted the lid slowly, the hinge moving without sound, revealing its contents under the steady beam of the flashlight. Inside, everything was arranged with care, not cluttered, not hurried, but deliberate. A folded map, aged but intact, a small stack of documents bound together, and at the center, resting on top, a photograph protected within a clear sleeve. Ethan reached for it, his fingers steady despite the quiet shift happening inside him, and lifted it into the light. The image was simple, taken somewhere open, perhaps years ago, two figures standing side by side, one of them unmistakably familiar even through the passage of time. The posture, the expression, the way he stood as if always listening to something just beyond the moment. Ethan's breath slowed as he looked at it, the connection forming not through explanation, but through recognition, the kind that did not need to be taught. The other figure stood close, their presence just as clear, just as real, a reminder that the past was never truly separate, only waiting for the right moment to surface. Behind him, the signal continued its quiet repetition, no longer just a call, but an anchor, tying this place, this room, this moment, to something far beyond the cabin above. Ethan lowered the photograph slightly, his eyes lingering on it as if searching for something more, but what he found instead was a sense of completion beginning to take shape, not an ending, but a closing of distance, a bridge between what had been left behind and what had finally been found. Rex shifted once, laying his head gently against the floor, calm now, at peace in a way that spoke louder than any movement he had made before, and in that stillness, Ethan understood that this had never been about discovery alone. It had been about remembering something that had refused to be lost, something that had continued to call, night after night, until it was finally heard. The photograph did not leave Ethan's hand right away, as if the weight of it was more than paper, more than ink, something carried through time with intention. And as he stood there in the quiet chamber, the steady pulse of the radio continuing behind him, he felt the distance between past and present narrow in a way that did not ask for explanation, only acceptance. He turned the photograph slightly, the light catching its surface, revealing the faint crease along one edge, a mark of years spent being held, moved, preserved, and for a moment he wondered how many times it had been looked at before it found its way here. How many decisions had led to this exact placement, this exact moment? Rex remained beside the table, his presence calm, grounded, no longer searching, no longer signaling, as if the path he had been following had reached its end, and what remained now belonged to Ethan alone. Slowly, Ethan placed the photograph back into the container, not out of detachment, but out of respect, understanding that its purpose was not to be taken away, but to be found, to be seen, to be understood in the place it had been waiting. His eyes moved once more across the room, taking in the details with a different awareness now, the arrangement of the shelves, the quiet order of the tools, the steady glow of the panel beside the radio, all of it part of something that had been held together not by chance, but by design. He stepped back toward the radio, the signal still, repeating, unchanged, patient as ever, and for a moment he simply listened, no longer searching for meaning, because the meaning had already revealed itself, not in the pattern alone, but in the journey it had created. He reached out and gently turned the dial, not to silence it completely, but to soften it, lowering the volume until the clicks became a quiet presence rather than a call, something that could remain without needing to be answered again. The room did not change when he did this. The air remained still, the walls unchanged, but something within him settled, a quiet alignment that had been waiting as much as the signal itself. Rex stood slowly, stretching once before stepping closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's leg, a simple gesture, familiar, grounding, and Ethan rested his hand briefly against the dog's back, feeling the steady warmth there, the living presence that had brought him here without hesitation, without doubt. Together, they turned toward the ladder, the path back to the surface now visible in a way it had not been before. Not just a way out, but a return, a continuation. Ethan paused at the base of the ladder and looked back once more, not to question, not to search, but to acknowledge, to recognize that some things were not meant to be carried forward, only understood in the moment they revealed themselves. Then he began to climb, each rung bringing him closer to the quiet world above, the faint square of light growing larger with every step, the air shifting, becoming lighter, familiar again. Rex followed close behind, his movements steady, confident, as if the space below no longer held anything for him to uncover. When Ethan stepped back onto the wooden floor of the cabin, the difference was subtle but unmistakable. The air warmer, the silence softer, the night outside unchanged, yet somehow less heavy. He lowered the hatch carefully, sealing it once more, not to hide what he had found, but to protect it, to leave it as it had been intended, a place that held its purpose without needing to explain it. The clock on the nightstand read 3:27 now, the red numbers steady, indifferent to what had just unfolded beneath it, and Ethan sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his breathing even, his thoughts quiet. Rex lay down beside him, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, no longer listening for anything beyond the room, because there was nothing left to hear. And in that stillness, as the night continued without interruption, Ethan understood something that did not need words, that some calls are not meant to pull you away from where you are, but to bring you back to something you had once lost, something that had waited patiently, not in the world outside, but just beneath your feet, until the moment you were finally ready to